our Ciampi visiting for this week. So and we'll today deliver a Ciampi lecture. Katrin, apart from being a good friend, she's a great scholar, great academic, working on social movements, labor movements, environmental movements. She has been involved in different projects, Swedish and international projects. She has an important record of publications, and she's also one of the editors of social movement studies. And Katrin is associate professor at the University of Uppsala. I think without further delay, we provide the floor to Katrin to start, and after Katrin lecture, Lorenzo will provide some comments in order to start the conversation. Katrin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you first, Lorenzo, for inviting me, and SNS for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, it's maybe very different topic to talk about labor mobilization, because I have so many different research parts that I haven't been talking about labor for a while. So I'm really happy that I got this opportunity. And so what I will do today is that I will give you really rather short overview of like title says, strikes, blockades, and social conflict. But with a focus on Sweden, and the idea is really the labor mobilization since mostly focusing on 90s, 80s, and afterwards, just to give you a short kind of idea of what's going on there. And I probably will, 40 minutes or so, and then have opportunity to have questions, and you all obviously have opportunity to ask questions as well. Hope to answer them as well I can. So let me see if I manage to get this thing work. All right. Yes. Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. Right. As I said, it's going to be this kind of short historical maybe lecture. Idea is that in Sweden, obviously those who have read something about the Nordic countries and the industrial conflict in Sweden or other welfare states, there is a lot of this discussion that they are very peaceful. Nothing really goes on there. Usually the unions are very strong, and they've already maybe achieved many things, and there is this kind of peaceful labor market. That's a kind of typical standpoint what you find in the different kind of articles. But one can really ask, is it so? Is it really so quiet in the Swedish labor market as we sometimes believe? And my talk will focus on three things that I think, or maybe the argument that I will build up is that it's not maybe so peaceful. And particularly because if we look some other things than strikes, because that's what we usually do. We look at the number of strikes and say that, oh, right, there are no strikes. Something probably is not happening. My suggestion is that saying that, yeah, maybe we can look other things that trade unions do. I will talk a bit about blockades. Then I talk a bit about threat of action, meaning that is kind of threatening to strike or threatening to take industrial action, but not really taking it. And then also some other, what we call usual protests. So any social movement scholar would say, oh, that's street demonstrations or, yeah, mostly street demonstrations. So I will look at those three things and then we can discuss, is it really so peaceful or maybe not, and why? And start with, it's really kind of, I give you really few facts about the Swedish trade union movement, just to kind of set the scene, so that I don't expect you to know too much of that, and there is no reason. There are three major trade union confederations in Sweden. LO, which is a kind of workers' union. Then there is a TCO, which is a more kind of white-collar union. And then there's also the third one, which is very small, SACO, which is more for people who are highly educated professions, like university teachers, for example. And there are, of course, a few independent unions like pilots and dock workers, and they are not related to these three confederations. And usually we can see later on also maybe to take different kind of actions than these major confederations. Another important thing to know about the Swedish labor market in general is that 66% of people who are employed belong to some union. So it's a really high level of trade union membership in terms of the, like how big percentage of the employed people are there. Obviously, workers a bit less than white collar employers, but it's still significant. It has declined over years. We'll show the numbers as well. And particularly among the blue-collar workers, the membership has declined, but still in comparison, for example, in Italy or in other European countries, or even worse in Eastern European countries, it is a significant number. So very many people belong to union. I can also say that when I, 2002, moved from Estonia, where I'm born, to Sweden, then as a person growing up in Soviet Union, I was really kind of suspicious about trade unions because of the connection with the communist system. But when I understood that everyone at this workplace were members of unions, and they were kind of really looked at me, you're not going to join the union? What are you going to do? And then I joined the union. But it was really kind of hard thing to experience. It was this kind of social pressure. You have to be a member of the union. And everybody are. You can choose what union you want, but you have to be a member, almost. It's kind of social pressure. So it's not surprising that so many people are part of the union. Another important thing is that there is a very high, probably because of these, of course, the trade union membership, there is a very high percentage of employed who are covered by collective agreements. So setting the salaries and working conditions, and it's kind of 88% of everybody employed are covered by these collective agreements. In public sector, everyone are covered. Again, this is important because in Sweden, the unions can strike only at the time when collective agreements are discussed. So this is important to remember that they cannot organize a legal strike when they have a collective agreement. Only when it is renegotiated with employer organizations, then they can start strikes. So this sets a different kind of institutional barriers for mobilization of strikes. Of course, you can have illegal strikes, it's not kind of happens, but most of the unions follow this kind of system. So every time the collective agreement is discussed, there is an opportunity to strike. While other form of industrial actions obviously are not affected by that, but we come to that. So it's important to kind of recall that we have these collective agreements. Now, let's look first this kind of historical picture of I didn't see those, sorry. Yeah, see, I heard the numbers. It's hard to have two screens simultaneously. I apologize for that. All right, historical numbers then for the strikes and lockouts. It is just, lockouts is obviously the one that is opposite to strikes when the employer organizations are organizing. But here, idea is to show you the waves of strikes, and there are small numbers, so if you don't see them, worry. But it starts somewhere from 1903 and then last until 2005 is here. I will show you the other one. But the goal is to show that in the early days, really kind of the early 1900s, there was huge action of the kind of labor mobilization was really significant. And after this decline, after these first waves, then this kind of idea of this peaceful labor market actually generated. So if you look now another picture, which is kind of better to see the 1980s afterwards, then the numbers of strikes really started to decline. So we have these unofficial strikes, which are those illegal strikes. In Sweden, they're called labeled unofficial and official. So we don't use the label legal, illegal. But in general, there is like no specific difference. But idea, you would say so that these unofficial strikes are the ones that are mobilized outside the collective agreement discussions, or the unions have not asked permissions to strike. I'll come back to that later on. But what you see here really is that it seems that, you know, they've disappeared. If you look at 2019, there is like nothing going on. It's really peaceful. Now, but these are numbers of strikes, obviously. And if we go for, I have here, if you look at the numbers of workers who strike, or what we call also the working days lost due to strikes. So you have the number of workers who strike and how long they strike. So it's kind of combination of these. Then, of course, the picture is a bit different. You really can see that even though the number of events as such has become really small, the amount of working days lost has not declined. So there is actually going on significant mobilization, but it's maybe focused on a few events, few significant events, which kind of mobilize then loads of people. So this is kind of the first sign saying that, all right, if you compare those two pictures, yeah, there are no strikes, almost, or very few, but those who are there, they are involving very many people. Of course, we have these unofficial strikes. They usually are many, as you saw as well, but they are not involving so many people, while the official strikes are really involving many people. So one can really ask this kind of question, that is the Swedish labour market then peaceful, as you would argue if you just look at the numbers of strikes, or yeah, mostly the strike events. And what could be this kind of argument against it? Why was it so that usually we talk about trade unions which are strong, as I said, very many people are still members, but there are not much of events going on when you look at strikes. So one can ask maybe the question, have unions in Sweden replaced their strike activism with some other actions? So maybe they do something else. Maybe they don't strike, but they have some other ways of showing their disappointment or dissatisfaction. Because we know that the union density or the numbers have not declined so much. I'll show you another number of that. We also know that there are clearly reasons to be dissatisfied with both the salary, the working conditions. The jobs are still moving to other countries, for example. There are still areas where you don't have the collective agreement. There are also reasons to do solidarity actions, both with the international events or inside the country. So there are political reasons, obviously, to mobilize. So there are definitely, clearly, reasons to mobilize. But if you look at the strike numbers, you don't see that. Some other arguments, when you look for the industrial relations scholars, they would say that, okay, it also depends not only about the resources the unions have or the motivation, but it might be also this kind of economic conditions like unemployment, for example, which affects the level of strikes, what we know. But if you look at the Swedish numbers, I would say that, yes, unemployment goes up and down, but it maybe does not explain this clear decline. I show you a few numbers just to kind of show. Here is then the membership of those three trade union confederations. Yes, it is a decline for the LO, the kind of workers union. So there is kind of construction workers, for example. While the service workers unions are going up, and also the same for the highly educated professions. So it's not kind of clear decline in union membership. It is really maybe the decline of workers. And that's maybe important thing to think about the relations to the strikes and then that the workers' unions are losing their members, while other unions are not losing so many members proportion-wise. The other thing, unemployment, as I said, goes up and down, but it's not really that it is so high that people don't want to protest or they are afraid of losing their jobs, so they don't organize the strikes or the unions. Yes, it is sometimes high, sometimes low, and there has been like relatively high up since the last economic crisis, maybe, and has not come down. There are obviously different reasons for that. So how we can then go and measure these different labor conflict and talk about that. So what I'm building my argument on is really this idea that we need to look different kind of labor conflicts. And obviously, the usual way of studying the industrial actions is measuring the number of strikes and number of working days lost, as I showed you in this graph. But I and Jansson, with whom we have studied these labor conflicts in Sweden since, I think now almost 10 years, we really would argue that there are other forms of actions that we need to look at. And there are really so many different kind of labor disputes going on. And what we did is that we wanted to look into the Swedish union's archives and really like try to see what are they doing, what is it what's going on, are they doing anything else than strikes? And we realized that there are so many disagreements, what we call then the labor disputes, and there are very many threats of strikes, but they are not implemented. So the unions are actually threatening to strike in relation to different kind of labor conflicts, like when they, for example, then renegotiate for the collective agreement and cannot come to the agreement over the level of wage, or unions are demanding some improvements in terms of working hours, and the employers are not giving after, then the unions do submit a threat to strike, saying that we will strike if you don't agree with us. And after that, sometimes, I will show you how often, employers give up, say, all right, and then there is no strike. So it seems to be that there is a kind of let's say, the conflicts behind the screen, so that you don't see that when you just look at the numbers of strikes, you don't see that. But when you go into the documents, you really see that it's going on there. And what we also discovered then, that there were like blockades, the term at all, which is usually you only look for the statistics of strikes. But we realized also that Swedish unions actually register also when they do a blockade. I will show you also what the blockade is in terms of the definition. They also go to the labor court, and that's something that I will not talk so much about today, because that is our new project idea, to really see how much actually the trade unions are combining all these strikes, blockades, street actions with the litigations and going to the labor court, because it seems that this is a new way of doing. But I'm going to not talk about that too much. So the data sets, what I'm basing my images here, or the figures, are really taking then from this one project about the notice of industrial action. Union. Let's see if I can. So 3 sources of information here. This one dataset that we have built together with Jenny is then based on these notices of industrial actions. Every Swedish union has to send, if they want to do any industrial action, strike or a blockade, 7 days ahead, they have to submit a notice of that. And all these notices are nicely archived. So you can study all of them. What was it about? Who did it? Where they did it? And how many workers were planned to take out. So it's a really detailed, fantastic information you can use. Unfortunately, there are like hundreds of pages of information, and we had to digitalize that, so it took a lot of time. But we are now done with it, and we can like show the numbers of that. So these some of the analysis based on then used kind of these notices, and then I also combined it with my own Swedish protest database, which is based on news media, like really reading newspapers and collecting data about this kind of different kind of actions, what trade unions can do, both demonstrating on the streets, but in Swedish case also using newspapers as a kind of arena for protest, because they send a lot of letters to the editors, and there is also debate articles. One has to remember that in compared to the Italian case, where most of this kind of protests are taking place on the streets, in Sweden, quite a lot of protest is going on verbally it's very quiet in the streets often, but it's a lot of things going on the news media. So it's a bit different protest culture, what you can say. Well, I have also looked then the registers of Swedish police, like how often this kind of really, the unions have asked permission for street demonstrations, because these are all official records, you can easily get them and use them. So let me first show you, we think it's kind of really innovative idea that looking at blockades instead of the strikes. So I'm pretty sure you're aware of the word blockade, and usually one thinks about people maybe stopping a street or something. But here is in case of the industrial action, it's a bit different. And according to the Swedish labor law, actually the blockades are really legitimate action. It's actually similar as a strike. You are allowed to do that. And the idea is to prevent economic transactions and you can do it in two ways. The one is that to block what we call unscheduled work, or let's say the overtime work. And as a kind of recent examples, one can have the healthcare workers and nurses. They refused to work overtime. So it was really this kind of overtime ban, and they asked permission for that and organized that. It doesn't go into the official strike statistics. It's calculated separately. So one reason why we don't see a number of strikes is that we have so many of these events of blockades where they say that we're not going to work overtime, we don't allow you to employ new people. So they're really stopping what we call unscheduled work, meaning that this work was not planned, because you're not supposed to work overtime, and they refuse to do that. So this is one form of blockade, and it's surprisingly common for the unions to use. Another one form of blockade, which is probably actually more known, is really this kind of blocking the specific work tasks, also known circulation struggles. And here you can have probably the most known international case is a Tesla example. Like since 2023, the Swedish trade unions are fighting with Tesla because people working for Tesla cannot have their collective agreement. And then there was a significant solidarity action. And for example, the postal workers, they decided that we're not going to deliver the number plates for cars. So you can't sell Teslas in Sweden. Of course, they figured out a new way, and the Teslas are still sold. So maybe not so many anymore, because there are other reasons for not buying that. But the action here is really, again, not the strike. It is physical event where they say we're not going to deliver these number plates. And because the unions call it blockade, it doesn't go into the official strike statistics. Just rely on the official strike statistics. You don't see any of these. You just, there were not so many things going on. So this is one really important aspect that I think it definitely, of course, might not be the same in different countries. We have now looked a bit of the other Nordic countries, and there seems to be similar legislation that you can have, that the accepted form of actions. But it would be interesting to hear how it is in Italy, like whether it's allowed similarly, or how it is in international comparison. But at least in Swedish case, really, we haven't found anyone written about this, and we're really surprised because it seems to be important part of the union work. So the topics what you can use for the blockades are really the same as you have for any other labor conflicts. So you can use them for inside the collective agreement negotiation, the typical what we call then the wage bargaining, but also demanding collective agreement. As I said, that not everybody have them. But we noticed also that a significant amount are related to the political actions, using blockade against the Swedish government policies, and showing international solidarity. Now, more recently, obviously, we have had events related to the Gaza or the Ukraine war. But there are, like, historically, we can go back and see that there are blockades related to the Coca-Cola campaign, mobilizing against the US related events. So there are really significant amount of international solidarity. And then there are very many small local conflicts, like really specific workplace related conflicts. So they are kind of similar as the strikes. There's nothing really different in these terms. And then just to show you a few numbers here, that how common the blockades are then, and compared to the, for example, the strikes. And then now it's only, I'm showing here the number of official strikes. Obviously, the official strikes have declined. But yeah, we have to admit that actually even the number of blockades have declined. So this kind of initial excitement that, oh, we found a new form of action that maybe is showing that the unions are replacing their one form of industrial action with other, at least empirically, has not got so much support. It's not that they do one or another, they do both, but they're still kind of doing it in a not very active level, at least when you compare to the 1980s and the mid-90s, the numbers are actually going down. But nevertheless, we was thinking that the blockades are something which are still important. And show you here the one very unclear figure, but idea is to show here is that who are the ones who are doing these blockades, because this is important to kind of think about. And what you see there are these, they're unfortunately in Swedish, but I will translate it to you. Like idea, usually we say that the union size or the trade union membership that correlates somehow to these different kind of actions, what they do. And here you can see that most of the blockades are actually done by the smaller unions, those who have very small membership. SAC, this is a syndicalist union, independent union, the most active and militant union in Sweden, very, very small. And most of the things what they do are these kind of 2-3 people blockades or 2-3 people strikes. So they are the ones who are doing loads of events, but if you look in terms of the working days lost, for example, it doesn't come up anywhere because they're very small. But the other actions that are done most are the transport workers unions, electricity workers unions, and we also have a dock workers and pilots doing this kind of blockades, which are really particularly related to the there is also one which is all the people who are working on the ships. So this kind of export related or transport related unions are the ones who obviously can use blockades more than others, but also are using them significantly. And definitely you can see that if you compare, for example, the cost of strike for the union, yes, you have to use the strike funds to pay for the lost salary. Well, when you do a blockade, you don't use that because it's not official strike. You don't need to pay for that. So for the unions, the blockade is actually a cheaper form of industrial action. And you would never also expect them to use it much more than strikes because it doesn't cost you so much. But of course, it costs for the members, time-wise and mobilization-wise. But for this particular transport sector, I really think that they can manage to cause a lot of damage for both for the sector, but also make a significant point for the employers organizations. But again, yes, they don't use it so much as you would expect to do that. So the other thing that one can then look at are these threats. And as I said, that the unions have to submit the notice of industrial action, either for the strike or blockade, whatever they want to do. If they want to have it legally, they have to submit the notice. And then we can collect those the information about these notices. And when we look the numbers of these notices, then it's also like with strikes, it's not very big, but you can also see that there are, depending on what kind of sector you are, mostly they're using it in the private sector. It's much higher, this kind of threats. And they are like very rarely used or seldom used by unions. I can also say that maybe the negotiations are working better in public sector than in the private sector, but also maybe that you're really using the threat of action in these private sector unions. Let me see if I have a, yes, this is maybe a better picture. Here you can see then the idea that how many of these threats are escalating to the real strikes. So even if it's maybe a bit messy figure, idea is really you can see that the number of this kind of what we call labor disputes, so the disagreements between the union and the employers' organizations, there are always obviously disagreements, but if this disagreement involves at least one threat of strike, then we have this solid line that goes up and down. And if you look in general, the kind of the running mean, what we call, then it has not disappeared, like declined as much as the number of strikes. It's kind of similar since the 80s. It's the picture of threats is much more active or kind of clear compared to the escalated strikes, because if you look at the number of strikes, then it goes down, and there are very few compared to the threats. And in one of the recent articles with in the social movement studies, then Jansson, we really made an analysis to show whether these threats, do they pay off or not? So can we say statistically that when you threatening, you tend to win? And it's really the case. So that if you compare these all these threats with the cases where there is a strike or not, and if you assume, and we make a really relatively strong assumption, obviously, that if there is no strike, the union wins. So if they don't need to go to strike, then they have won. And as you see, most of the cases actually, the threats are not escalating to the strikes. They tend to win. In that sense, it's kind of, one can say that Swedish unions don't need to strike. They don't need to take an action because they can win anyway. They just threaten to strike, and they don't need to come and use their funds for the strike funds or anything, because it's enough to kind of say that they will do that. I will come back to the one possible downside of this winning in the end, but in a way it seems that it's kind of reasonable way of going, that you don't need to do anything more than just threaten the strikes. It's important, of course, that the threat is credible, because if you do a lot of threatening and you never strike, then in one time point, you're not believed. But here it's important to recall that a threat of strike is really something that unions take seriously in Sweden. So if they threat, they are also really decided that we're going to, if we don't win, we'll implement this. So that it is credible threat. At least when you also talk with employers' organizations, they know that if the threat is it will go. If there is no agreement, then it will be implemented. So the last form of action, just to kind of shortly then, that because as I said, we were thinking that okay, maybe these strikes numbers or the strikes are replaced by either blockades or the threats, or the street protest. So if you look at the street protest of the unions, then again, it's based on news media data, so it combines both demonstrations and strikes. Very few events of civil disobedience in Sweden. As I said, protests are really calm. Nothing really, not violence, particularly with the unions, are very few. I would say that there haven't been any violent events related to the union-related protest at all, almost. So here again, if you look at the trends, it's going down. So it's kind of the more and more we come to the 20s, the number of events are declining. You can also see that in relation to the percentage of events. Maybe this is a better way of measuring, because the numbers of protests are going up and down depending what's happening in the political sphere. But if you look the percentage of labor protests, of all the protests, so there are kind of these red post here in the image are all kind of labor issues or trade union related protests, then they have in a way a bit increased even, but it still kind of goes up and down, obviously, but it has not disappeared as a percentage of protests. And maybe entire number of protests in Sweden have declined. Also, you can see that it's probably related to the way we measure the protest, because we use newspapers here, and some of the protests are moving to the internet and different kind of social media platforms. But when you look at these numbers, then you see that the percentage somehow is slightly increasing, but it really actually reflects the political situation, because in recent years we have had more right-wing government, for example. It's the unions are reacting to that quite significantly. And the last pictures here is kind of from the street protest numbers, and the same as it is with the media reports. Now, of course, these are the numbers where usually when you want to use when you want to mobilize a street demonstration in Sweden, you have to apply for permission. I think in everywhere you have to do that, and usually you get the permission, but it's very rarely you don't get it. And if you look at these numbers, then the unions, when they have organized it, usually it's not very high, but they mobilize in two occasions, what I can kind of say. One is elections. During the election campaigns, really the trade unions are on the streets mobilizing a lot together with the political parties. And then during the last years, they have mobilized, for example, in relation to the Gaza events. You can really see the dock workers mobilizing for that. And here, yeah, there are two figures here. We can see one is the upper one is the total number, and that the lower one is the percentage of union-related protests to others. So what has happened kind of here? What can we draw conclusions, or what is a kind of what might explain these changes that we have seen? That the numbers of strikes are going down, the blockades, yeah, they are there, but maybe also not increased so much. There are a few things that one has to remember also, in addition to the factors that I mentioned before. Unofficial strikes have become more expensive. Used to be 200 kronas, which is kind of 20 euros fine for organized unofficial strike, really small. In 1991, the government decided that it has to be changed, and it became 2,000 kronas, which means 200 euros. So from 20 euros to 200 euros, like a fine for participating in a wildcat or unofficial strikes. So that might explain partly when the unofficial strikes went down, it became more expensive for the unions. The other aspect is that in 1997, there was something which is called industrial agreement. The trade unions and employer organizations decided that we can follow a specific system of collective bargaining. And some of the unions, particularly export sector related unions, because Swedish economy is based on export. mostly you produce so many products that you sell, often to Germany, but also many other countries. And the export sector is really strong. And also other unions then decided, okay, we will follow what kind of agreement the export sector decides, and we follow their, let's say, the wage level. That they decided, okay, we agree upon the increase of wages in 2%, then all the other unions take a lead from there, and they follow the similar kind of numbers. So that unions and employer organizations note there is no relation with the state. State stays out of the collective bargaining in Sweden. State is kind of, it's there obviously, but employers and unions are decided that they negotiate. And in 97, it really was this discussion that we come to the agreement, all the unions follow, and there will not be much of the strikes. That was the idea, at least. And then the state, what state did was that they founded something which is called mediation office, trying to provide really this kind of help for the, more and more help for them, mediating the conflict between the labor and capital, you would say. Of course, there was also mediating before, but since 2002, there was kind of more regulated, and there was strong emphasis to providing the mediator when the conflict appears. Also, for our scholars' sake, mediation office has really good records, like all of these kind of strike numbers and the reports of the related conflicts are up in the web. Everybody can read it easily if you read Swedish or nowadays translated. So it's very kind of, it opened up and it became much more transparent. The other, in addition to these institutional changes, we also have to say that unions obviously have changed, partly because of the globalization of the economy, all these kind of processes, what have happened in the world. But also unions have become more and more professional. For example, they focus on providing services to the members for insurance. It's not so important to be a member of the union for the solidarity reasons, but because you get health insurance, or not the health insurance, but additional health insurance, because usual health services are anyway covered, but these kind of extra things. You can even get cheaper to the cinema. So there are very small, tiny things. As a union member, you get a list of what kind of small services you get. And they are not all cool things. And ideally, it is to get the new young people to be members of unions, but it also removes this idea of solidarity and being, mobilizing for the reasons what you usually have trade unions for. It really focuses on what you can get from a union membership. So I would say that they're not so much more fight related or this kind of mobilization related, but it's really kind of benefit organized. I have one slide here for the, kind of trying to put this kind of three eras, what we have looked at since the 80s now, in relation to these changes. So if you would say that the unofficial strikes were really cheap, until 91, then it is really something which has happened. If you look at this kind of the wildcat strikes, they have disappeared almost. While during periods, the number of strikes, now it's all averaged in terms of the working days lost. During the first two periods, number of official strikes, almost similar, while the wildcat strikes really dropped. So probably one, of course, aspect is this factor that it became more expensive. But there are also other reasons. Probably the new unions realized that it's to discuss with each other. And we have also made interviews and seeing that the unions see more and more official strikes as a more reasonable way. But if you compare this before and after this industrial agreement, what I said, that the unions decided that they follow the lead of the export sector. That seems to have really kind of stronger effect, because after that, the average number of strikes is really declining. If you look for the other forms of actions, the blockades, and now for the official blockade, also kind of in similar Maybe it went up a bit during the 92, 96, but the average number then declined during the last years. And if you look at these threads of actions, yes, they have been up for a while, but really after the industrial agreement also declined. And these demonstrations and all the other forms of actions and all the other forms, here we think it's kind of the newspaper articles, for example, where the unions write emails, but also flash mobs and as much as you can get the different kind of actions. These are, yeah, they have not increased definitely compared to the early periods. So what we can say is that in general, there's still kind of the when I started in saying that the Swedish unions are peaceful and maybe there is a reason to re-evaluate the situation. One has to admit that yes, they are still very peaceful. Nothing has changed too much. Yes, they maybe protest a bit more on the streets, but that's more as a reaction to international events. They have not replaced strikes with the blockades, but they just use the blockades all the time. We just discovered them now as scholars, and probably we'll need to look more on that. What we think is important are those threats of actions, and these are the ones that are not declined. They are still there, and it seems that this is probably one major argument why we see that the unions are still winning. You know, the working conditions are improving, not every sector, but in quite many sectors. And also the working hours regulations are there. So there are improvements going on slowly, and probably because of these threats of industrial action rather than a real action. So maybe one can say that these kind of social struggles in Sweden, they have moved from these very active times when you can see the newspaper articles about strikes all the time in early 19th centuries, or even before like 70s, the strikes were everyday events, to today where you very rarely see in the newspapers what's going on. You read about a few events, and really much is going on behind the scenes, so that there is a lot of negotiation there, which makes it, of course, harder for the scholars to study. But then again, as we show that you can go to the archives and look these threads, it is still possible. I would stop here.
Yes, thanks a lot, Katrin. Very interesting work. I'm happy to have the possibility to interact with you on this. I think that what you presented is very important for three main reasons. First of all, I think there is a lot of value in showing the persistence of labor conflict, okay, throughout the evolution of different historical phases. I think it's interesting also to look at mobilization, and in particular about labor mobilization in terms of power, cost, efficacy, okay, in very strategic based terms. And I think it's also very important the attempt to widen the view on different forms of labor action, okay, not on strikes in a strict sense. You were asking in the beginning, okay, also about different contexts and so on, and obviously it's very difficult to hear what you were presenting and not to think about the Italian counterpart, okay. I don't want to speak a lot about that. I only need to stress two main factors that make a comparison very difficult. The first is, of course, union pluralism. Right? Union pluralism makes everything more complicated. On the one hand, this makes the Italian trade union confederations more militant. Okay, while on the other hand, it makes them weaker. And this being, a Cold War outcome that we have since 1947, okay, which is a structural part of the way which labor conflict works in this country. And the other element I want to stress is that for what I understood from a legal institutional point of view, in Sweden, striking is a collective right. Okay. In Italy, striking is an individual right. Which, on the other hand, it makes it stronger. We have in the Constitution the individual right to strike. So, for example, the idea that you can strike only when bargaining contracts have to be renewed, etc., would be unconstitutional. Okay, in Italy, although we have regulation on striking, I'll talk about that later. On the other hand, okay, it obviously makes striking much more scattered, okay, and definitely much less focused in specific and very efficient context. From my point of view, it was very interesting to witness a context in which strikes are legally difficult, while blockades are legally easier, okay? Because we live in a context in which it's exactly the opposite. Of course, blockades that happen within labor struggles in Italy tend to happen in occasional strikes, okay, in addition to strikes, and they tend to have a more confrontational character in terms of, and it has to do with what I was saying before, okay, in a whole reflection on the efficacy of striking when you have the context of pluralism and scattered and so on, in which it's quite difficult for a strike to be extremely efficient within a specific scope, okay? And thus the blockade can raise the stake of conflict and makes the power to create damage to your opponent higher, and thus strengthen the possibility to strike. And it was very interesting to me this idea of the blockade as a cheaper alternative to striking. Now, having said that, I wanted to ask you a few questions on elements that I consider particularly interesting in what you presented. First of all, you didn't say it explicitly, but it seemed to me that you're considering union density as something that strongly correlates with strike participation. Union density is a good indicator for strike participation, and this would be very interesting from my point of view, because I don't know a lot about the Swedish case. In the Italian context, we've been witnessing for something which is service-based, is based on a wide series of benefits like the ones you were mentioning at the end, and thus it rarely translates into active labor militancy. Okay, you can be a union member because you go and do your taxes, especially within, and certain trade union confederations have theorized and practiced a new model of union membership, which is based on much more on service provision and partially on workplace representation, and less on direct conflict with their counterparts. Second thing is that what you're showing, especially with the efficacy of strike threats, okay, seems to me something that shows a path dependency of protest credibility, and it would be very interesting to look from the point of view of, in the sense that to the extent in which striking works, then threatening to strike can be very efficient because you have a very strong weapon, okay? And so my question on this is that, do you think that strike threats and strikes are, at the end of the day, in terms of efficacy, the result of the same power? In the sense that if you have the capacity to strike and be successful in striking, you build the path dependency of credibility, the feeling of efficacy that makes it so that you don't even have to strike. Okay, well, obviously a path dependency of defeats, okay, would make also a lot less efficient strike threats. And the last question I wanted to ask you, if I understood correctly, you're focusing mostly on national strikes, right? To renew collective bargaining agreements. And this is interesting because if I look at labor conflict in Italy, this is of course one side, okay? But in protest event terms, it would be a very small portion of labor struggles, okay? Even within LiveWhat, when we were coding political claims related to the economic crisis in Italy, it was clear that local workplace conflict based on industrial crisis, based on the fact that a company is closing or it's delocalizing or a production plant is closing down, are by far not only the largest part of labor conflict, but the largest part of collective action at large in Italy. Okay, the most common episode of collective action at large in Italy is there is a plant. Okay, there is an industrial crisis, and workers are doing something about that. Obviously, this is something which is different from what you're seeing in that model. But I'm interested in whether you think that a similar analysis could apply to context in which obviously you have less power in terms of you have a weaker position to start with, okay? And this brings me to the need, I think, of an analysis that take into account also the economic structure of what you're showing. Obviously, one thing is to renew a bargaining agreement within a growth framework, okay, and another thing is trying to stop a company from delocalizing within a context of crisis. These are the points that came into my mind while listening to your talk. The last thing I want to say, and I was commenting also with Lorenzo, we're very envious about your data, okay? Because data on strikes, collecting data on strikes in Italy is a nightmare. I've tried to do hundreds of times, okay? But finding reliable data on strikes in this country is very, very difficult for a wide series of reasons we could discuss. And yeah, we're envious.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Katrin, do you want to answer this and then we open?
Maybe this is easiest,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. And in a way, of course, it's good that you envy our data. I'm happy to share whatever you will do, the Swedish data. But it's also, I have to say that it has been a lot of work to also assembling our data, even though we have a load of good records. And this goes actually directly related to your last part of these localized strikes. So yes, what we have, all these events are related to the collective bargaining threats, so that these disputes that we look at are related to collective bargaining, because there you have really good data available. For these local events where you have workplace conflicts, of course they are there, and mostly they are related, and there are rather many of them, but the statistics about them is much harder to get. Historically, nowadays, like since this mediation office, actually, even there it's rather easy to get. But previously it has been harder, and that's the reason we have the data, but we haven't digitalized it. We have all the images. So this is something what we're doing now, trying to put together also the data set for the local events. But like what we can say already is that there are many local events, but they are very small. There is this one independent union, like as I said, also related to blockades, as I said, the militant syndicalist union. They are the ones doing these local workplace events, mostly when something is closed, or also when there are small disagreements related to workplace. But they are not like so many compared to but they will change the statistics. But definitely this is something we have to look at. And as much as we have looked, I would say that they have this path of inefficiency. they haven't won. There is clearly a path dependency of not succeeding for this particular union, but they are kind of persistent. They are still mobilizing and doing that, and sometimes do win. And they also do these kind of solidaristic actions that they join other confederations. Even though they are independent, they sometimes join other struggles, and then they might win. So I think this is a very important point, and I'm really grateful that you bring it out, because one has to make these differences between the unions, definitely, and also between these events. Going for the first question related to the union density and how that relates to the events. Yes, you would, in a way, you would think that the higher density, the more resources, you would do more actions. That's what you kind of expect. But what we find is that there is no so strong correlation. And even actually what we find that the unions that are very high density, meaning that then that it's not in terms of more members, it's more those people employed in this particular sector, how big proportion of them are unionized. And we don't find, like, we find that this is in terms of whether the strike threat is more effective or not. Actually, the lower density unions are even more successful, but it also depends on what sector you are. Even if maybe in some sectors it's enough for few workers or the few companies to stop or threaten to strike, because you can create a lot of damage. For example, in transport, again, this is a typical thing where you can do that. So we don't find this kind of very strong correlation with these. It depends a bit on the sector and union density. And often the big sectors where, like the public sector, where everybody are working hours are unionized, you don't find that they're always really effective in terms of getting what they want in the strikes, but also in the threats, they are actually not winning all the time. And the last one, this path dependency aspect, yes, I agree with you that it is probably some kind of trends that before maybe the strikes were successful and now it's enough to threaten. So it's kind of built on this historical experience. And I don't know how to disprove this. I just have to agree. Maybe in terms of the comparative cases, we can focus on one specific union and then see what happens with them. But because of you have these confederations, so it's hard to take out the unions. But I agree that that would be interesting to test, and we could do that with the table. I make a note for the next topic. Thank you.
There are questions? Guglielmo, Alba?
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and it's a shame. On data, we have not only Lorenzo, but a researcher who is in a group with Trento University and Cagliari and other countries to try to collect data on strikes, but he's doing fieldwork in Indonesia at the moment. I hope there will be other opportunities to talk about data on forms of labor conflicts. And thank you for the big picture, which shows quite clearly how conflict is an intrinsic feature of labor. Just even the first slide showing the huge strikes before the Basic Agreement of 1933. So social peace doesn't come out of nothing, come from conflict. Actually, conflicts reemerges in different forms. Although the general trend of fall of working days, strike working days, is nearly universal in advanced economies. Once you look at the details, it's fascinating how many differences there are and how in different forms. And in this sense, it was really, really interesting. Given that you asked for comparisons also with Italy, Lorenzo already made quite a few interesting points. But first, I would say, I would notice that the strike data, you said in Sweden there are fewer strikes, but they're quite big. In Italy, it's quite the opposite. The number of strikes hasn't fallen that much, but they are much smaller because we used to have huge, long sector-level strikes, and there are fewer. We used to have big factories which used to do big strikes, and they are not there anymore, or they don't go on strike in the same way. On the 3 points, the main points, I think, analytically, you said on blockades, on strike threats, and on union density. On the 2 small comments on the first 2 and the question on the third. On blockades, I think the fact it's interesting that they keep being there. I wouldn't expect them to grow because blockades are, as far as I understand it, please correct me, they are mainly solidarity actions. And people, most workers go on conflict when they're attacked in their own rights. The tendency to go on strike, I mean, I don't see the reason why at the societal level there should be an increase in solidarity with other workers. It's interesting that it keeps being there. It's very important, but because by the way, if you allow me to mention Laval, the fact that there has been a European Union law threat to the right of solidarity action in the form of blockades might have also affected in the last 15 years the likelihood of doing it. On strike threats, but there is a classic explanation. I mean, I think of Colin Crouch, the fact that labor conflicts are an iterative games. If the economy is a bit constant, let's say, in terms of sectors and companies. Once the actors know each other, they can largely predict what the outcome of a strike would be. Given a strike costs a lot to workers and to unions, it costs a lot to the employers. If you know more or less what the result would do, you do an agreement without a strike. However, it's quite interesting. That doesn't mean you have eternal peace because it's always dynamic and always it is contested. So every now and then there will be a strike again. In Germany, I have never studied Sweden in depth. So I studied Germany more in depth, and which is even more peaceful than Sweden in terms of number of strikes. But the unionists, at least in manufacturing, tend to say we need to have a strike once every 5 years just to remind workers how to do it. Otherwise, our threats are not credible. In the same way as the Swiss army keeps doing military drills, even if they haven't needed a war for hundreds of years. It's an interesting comparison. But the final question is on gun system. On here, I disagree a little bit with Lorenzo. That is, I agree with him on Italy, but I disagree on Sweden. That is, the link, the relationship between union membership and strikes depends on the country. In Italy, it doesn't matter. Unions were never really very interested in having many members, but they want workers to follow when there is a strike. In France, it is even more like that. They actively don't want to have many members, but they want to have many people going on strike. In Sweden, there are 2 reasons, I think, why it is very important. Union density is very important. First of all, your slide only showed the composition of union density. It didn't show the trend, and it has actually fallen. Obviously, still very high compared to the rest of Europe, but it has fallen. And it has fallen, I think, largely because the unemployment insurance system has changed. The famous GAN system, which you haven't mentioned. I wonder why. My question is why you haven't mentioned it. Do you think it is not important? Because that is one of the main reasons why people, one is social pressure, very, very good comment at the beginning. The other reason is if you want to have unemployment insurance in Sweden, and in Denmark and in Finland, you join a trade union because otherwise it's very complicated to sort it out. In theory, you can, but it's very complicated and more expensive. But in the last 20 years, the conservative government has made it more expensive to join the unemployment insurance through the trade unions, and therefore union density has fallen, and the labor governments have not reversed that point. And that means that especially precarious workers for whom unemployment insurance has become much more expensive, now they don't join much the trade unions. And why it is that important for strikes? Because Swedish unions have strike funds. If you're not a union member, you go on strike, you don't have a strike fund. It makes a huge difference. In Italy, it doesn't matter. Unions don't have strike funds. Also, you lose legal protection in case the employer wants to be nasty if you're not a union member. So there is a direct link. I'm not surprised by the fact that, I guess, the huge majority of near totality of people who go on strike, they are union members. So I would expect, maybe it's not, obviously there are many other different factors, but I would expect an important role for that. That was my question.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Guglielmo. We have Alba and then Cosmo. Alba,
Yep.
please.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I found it very interesting, actually, also because I'm researching blockades as well, though not exactly called that way. So yeah, very interesting. And perhaps I wanted some clarification regarding how it works actually in Sweden. So first is that is it mandatory in Sweden for a strike to be balloted by the union membership? That's first of all, no. Okay. And the second is that what is the actual proportion of workers, you might not have the figure, that effectively participate in a strike action when a strike is officially called? And I'm wondering about this because, so for example, here I'm sometimes a bit surprised in Italy because sometimes it feels like the strike success is measured, at least like by the media, in terms of how many people actually go to the streets, not the number of people who actually go on strike. And for me, that is interesting also because I'm researching the hospitality industry, and I interviewed a high-rank official in Spain who basically used the strike action as a threat as well when they were negotiating a collective agreement, but it was just bluffing. She was bluffing. I mean, because they called the strike for the Christmas days, I think it was the 24th, 25th, and the 31st. But because they didn't ballot, basically they just used it as a threat. And I was wondering, what if actually they didn't, the negotiations didn't succeed? What would have happened? So yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I'll sit here. Thank you for the very compelling presentation. While I lived in Sweden for my master's, and while living there, what actually struck me was this kind of, we can say, biopolitical management kind of social norm for which you shouldn't be angry or be loud, and trying to understand this trend beyond institutional and union reasons. I am actually wondering what does it mean for the unions to win through this strike threatening? Who declares this win? And also, what if maybe there is some kind of analysis also in the maybe discourse mobilization kind of part to understand how the affectivities around these mobilizations actually reason these wins, because I am wondering also if there is some kind of biopolitical management in controlling these dynamics, these tensions, since for the most peacefulness is preferred over tensions, conflict, violence, and also resolution. Thank you.
Yep. I had myself, and I think I'm close here to Cosmo and also like to Alba, that I'm wondering whether like you are thinking like to further exploit this type of data that you have, that is this threat of action, that seems to me like to be like, I mean, threat of action is clearly like something that trade unions, but other like actors, like collective actors, are using as a form of action. But what you have here is like the opportunity to map, this threat that is something most of the time is not visible. You can, of course, like study it with in-depth fieldwork if you are with an organization or a group. But here you are able like to, follow this long type of action that usually is not mapped. So I'm wondering, like, probably there is space to see like what does it happen when the threat is not satisfied. So when is not answered with a positive answer from the counterpart. I'm wondering, what does it mean at the collective action level? Pose a threat and to answer to a non-satisfied threat. But also, what is the mechanism of responding to a threat on the side of the factories? Like, I'm jealous here, like, but I'm also wondering, like, whether you are further exploiting these, because really, like, I think is a type of data that obviously, like, has to be read in relation to, like, this type of action within, like, a trade union conflict. But methodologically and analytically, like, you can clearly, like, exploit, like, toward the other forms of action where, like, threat is adopted. So I wonder about this. So.
Thank you so much for very good questions and reflections. First, I will go for this blockades as a kind of are they mostly solidarity actions or not? I don't think they are. At least, kind of, we are in the process of rereading our measurement amendment because we have discovered a few coding mistakes, as often you do when you have such a data. But in general, I would say that the solidarity actions are forming only 20%. Mostly there are these local conflicts of overtime ban, not employing new people. So this kind, and also this kind of the circulation struggles. So they are dominating actions. And then there are some, like Lorenzo said in the beginning, that in Italy you have this combination of blockade with the strikes. Like, yeah, the picket lines, obviously, we have this way. These are there, but these blockades are like separate of those, like in addition to those strike-related actions. So there are clearly the blockades without strikes. And I think it's important, this solidarity action. I agree that we have to look more on that, but particularly because they don't form like majority of the actions. That's the reason we thought that they should be used. And I very much agree with you that like the Swedish unions are rich. They can afford strike funds. They actually can afford strikes because historically they have so many funds. Now the unemployment system, yes, it was changed by the right-wing governments, and it has made it really difficult for the union membership declined after that. But in a way, probably not the only reason. At least that the studies that have been done and trying to figure out why people join or do not join, this one change, or the fact that also it has not been changed back by the Social Democratic government when they were in power, they don't think that it's the only reason. Part of the reason still seems to be that people just don't see the union membership as something important. And here I think actually, and also some of your questions go into this line, the fact that you can win with a threat of action probably is not supporting the trade union membership, because nobody sees this win. Yes, you hear about it. Okay, we threatened with the strike. We wanted to get better labor working conditions or a bit higher salary, and you get it. But because there is not much news about it, and then maybe unions themselves are not really strong in terms of telling about that. So the people who are members of the unions, they don't realize that they have actually won the struggle. And this kind of lack of visibility of the struggle, I think this is something which kind of the lack of collective identity creating in Swedish unions. And then you have to rely on the insurance or whatever aspect. So partly that we're now discussing actually trying to make a few interviews and thinking about how to measure this effect of winning on the workers or the people who are joined the actions. So definitely this is the kind of probably the part of it. Now about related to the strikes, there is no pilot. They're going to strikes. The Trade Union Confederation says we're going to strike or we're going to threat with a strike. You don't need to ask your members about that. So this is clearly different than in Italy or in UK or somewhere where you have these systems. What they can do, obviously, is that they have these annual congresses and they can complain that the union didn't do anything, but you can't react to this specific strike. So this is very different for the members. And they also, I think that the threat is always very credible because it's really the unions are deciding to go to strike. Then before that, they have also negotiated or bargained quite a long time. So this is something which is, it's still a last resort. Nobody wants to threaten a conflict. And that goes well with this kind of peacefulness aspect that, yes, compared for particularly Southern Europe, where it's okay to protest. In Swedish political culture, it's not there. It's like you talk more and negotiate rather than. But historically, it has not been a case. And really, like the Swedish unions were very militant in early 1900s. And Jansson, who I've been collaborating a lot, her PhD thesis was exactly about that, how the trade unions themselves realized that they can't have so militant members. So they tried to educate them to do fewer protests or to strike less, actually. So they were teaching, there was again specific study circles really trying to teach the union members that you have to negotiate and not to be so militant. So I think this kind of historical path has been there, and they're still having this kind of discussions, but nowadays, obviously, it has accepted there is a culture of peacefulness. But it probably leads to, like I said, this kind of loss of identity, maybe, eventually. Lorenzo, yes, the mechanism wise, we're reading something which is called mediation reports. So we don't only have the announcements that we're going to threaten strikes, but we also have the reports of those who mediate between those. So we can see what happens. Unfortunately, there are like loads of hundreds of pages. So now with the new AI systems, we probably can code them. But so yes, one day I will tell you about the mechanism. At the moment, I don't know.
Okay. There are no further questions, comments. I think we thank Katrin. Katrin will stay until Friday afternoon if anyone wants to yeah.
All right.
Leave before so you get back. Yeah. And as you might know, there is a Cosmos share in Strozzi right now. So.
All right.